Hello and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me in another of my wonderful interviews. Today, we're going to look at a sort of breaking a myth. So not so terribly conspiratorial, but there is a myth. Now, you may have seen these films. Christmas is coming and you may well be watching some of these old fantasy films, seeing the old knights gallivanting across the countryside in their shining armour. But wait, shining armour? Were they gallivanting in shining armour? Well, they may not have been gallivanting. That's one thing that we can probably dispel with. However, shining armour. I was sent this rather remarkable book. It's a beautiful book with some fantastic pictures. I'm not going to show them to you yet because we're going to look at some shortly. Beaten Black and Blue. There might be a clue in that, by Chris Dobson, the myth of the medieval knight in shining armour. I thought that's absolutely fantastic. It's so beautiful, so interesting. I got Chris to come on the show and he joins me now. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Richard. Lovely to be on the show.
It's lovely to have you here. Yes, Black and Blue, the knights in shining armour. And reading your book, you start right up with, spoiler alert,
Yes.
they didn't.
Yeah. Sorry to everyone out there, but no.
So that must cause a lot of people a lot of issues, because we see in museums, we see in country houses, we see all over the place these wonderfully polished shining armour, and it would be very difficult, unless you'd seen the reasons that you give, why that would not have been the case. But I haven't read the whole book. It does get technical in it, and you source Renaissance pictures, and you explain why sometimes the pictures aren't actually representing the truth, not because the painter wasn't necessarily trying to do it, but because of age. So much into this to get into, to understand why, when we're walking around a castle or a big country house, that suit of armour is not quite as it would have looked. And actually, the colours that you present, it seems to me that looking back, the medieval people really loved colour, and even in their armour. And so I'm fascinated to learn more. So over to you, Chris.
Okay. Well, to state my credentials, I've worked on armor for 4 decades. I started off as a young man actually making copies of the stuff, and then in time I got into restoration work. And that brought me into literally close-up contact with the real thing. So this very much ties into what you've been saying on podcasts recently about personal experience,
Right.
where you can actually see something, touch something, then you know you're looking at something real. And in all of that time, my experience of knowing how metals oxidize, how they corrode, or not how you can apply color finishes to ferrous metals, all came together. I didn't come into this, I didn't just wake up one morning and think, I know, I'll completely trash the accepted narrative of what armor looked like.
Yes.
Um, I started off, as we'll see in a minute, I started off making armor which was polished. And I believed, like everyone else, that these things were polished to within an inch of their lives. They were like mirrors. And just occasionally some were. But the whole point about this is that whilst what we now call white armor, which is polished armor, did exist, it's a tiny fraction. And it's inverted, because we think of later armors being colored or being left rough from hammerwork on them, and earlier ones were given these beautiful white polished finishes. But it's completely the other way around. And also, as a word on the art, before we get there, I began looking at medieval and Renaissance art as an aid to the research I was doing on the armors. And I eventually fell in love with the art itself. You know, I can look at a painting now without there having to be a suit of armor in it. Thanks very much. But that in itself, as you say, studying how paintings change over time, what's being done to them, is just as important as when you find a suit of armor in a museum and you look at it and you think, oh, that's lovely. But you don't know all the changes that have been made to it. And some of those are extreme. Anyway.
And just on, I mean, just on that, that's something that you talk about quite early on in the book, which is, I found really fascinating, because again, you kind of think, oh, we found this piece of armor somewhere, but even though it may have been laying in, I don't know, in somebody's loft or dug in the ground or whatever, before it got there, it may have had restoration work on it and all sorts of different people. So some of the armor you were saying has had so much work on it from its original manufacture, let's say, that it's very difficult to trace it unless, of course, you know where to look and you know the sort of things to look for.
And also, the original master craftsmen who made these things, I'm sure if a lot of them were to come back now and stroll into a museum, I would be saying, "What the hell have you done to my work?"
Yes. Yeah.
So, now you've talked before about having pegs for your hat removed well and truly.
Yes.
And now this isn't a case where I'm just going to take the hat peg and throw it in the bin. As you said, they loved use of color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that hat peg, remove it, and replace it with several others, which are even more interesting, which are even
Right.
better. Okay.
Okay. Yeah,
All right.
lovely.
So let's jump onto the first slide.
Okay. Here we go.
Right. Now, if we look at this slide, the armor on the left is in Glasgow. It's a composite armor. It's been put together from various others, and this is what people expect to find.
Yeah.
They think of it as a medieval suit of armor. Well, it's not medieval, it's a Renaissance piece, but it's mid 15th century, and this is what we call the Great Period. So, this is when people expect they're going to look like that. And the armor to the right of it is one I made myself while I was Master Armourer to the Royal Armouries at the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds in the UK. And that's a foot combat armor called a Tomlet armor made for tournaments. And as you can see, I polished it up. Now, thank goodness it's early 16th century because they were about then. There were white armors doing the rounds then. So thankfully, I didn't make a mistake with that. But if we move over to the right of the slide, you can see what I was talking about earlier. Now, the breastplate on the right is from the English Civil War. So it's mid 17th century and it's hammer finished. And because a lot of pieces of this date survive, this is associated with this later period. And you can see there's a painting by Frans Hals next to it, who's a member of the Haarlem Civic Guard. It's from the 1630s, and he's got a grey breastplate on. It's a better finish than the one on the right, but again, this is what we've come to associate with this later period. Now, just to cover the couple of pics at the bottom, that's my forge in action on the right.
Wow.
And then bottom center, now that will generate up to just hand pump charcoal forge, very analog, will generate up to 1300 degrees Celsius. You know, a hand pump charcoal forge can burn iron or steel away to nothing. So the power of the elements that you have, air, earth, fire, and water for quenching is quite, amazing stuff. But we look at the picture bottom center, we have different colors on steel. Now, this is a little bit of etymology for you. This is where we get the expression losing your temper. Because when you lose your temper, you snap, you break, and you lose control. And if you have a steel as opposed to an iron, steel has a slight carbon content, sort of above 0.3 carbon, typically 0.4, 0.5 for armor in the 15th century in Italy. And if it's got carbon in it, you can then actually heat treat it and harden it. Now, they would use a technique called slack quenching. They would bring it up to a red color, like in the photo there, let it cool down so it went gray, and then quench it, probably in oil. But equally, now that gives you a usable product. Okay,
yeah.
It's then tough, it's not brittle, so it's better than just steel.
And does it remain in that color? You've got the beautiful hues of color there.
Yeah.
And once you've got it to a certain temperature and you withdraw it and you put it into the water and that's it's sort of like photography. It fixes it, does it?
Yes, it does. And the different colors you saw there are for different tempers. So we go from yellow, what's called straw, through brown, reddish colors. Then it goes into purple and blue, and then very pale blue tailing off. Now, the yellowish colors are for things like scalpel blades, which are very sharp. They need to be able to cut beautifully, but are brittle.
Right.
You go on to brown. You could use that for something like modern drill bits, and then purple is for springs. So what happens is you fully quench the steel at red, and that it's then cold, but it's brittle. It's called glass hard. I've done this as a test. You can take a piece of carbon steel, smack it down on the anvil, and it will shatter. Now, if instead you polish up the surface so you can see where the color is going to develop, and then you heat it slowly in the fire or through another medium, which we'll come to later, then you see it start to go through those colors, and that is an oxide layer forming on the surface. And at a certain point, that's exactly what you do. You then quench it, you freeze it, and you do that in a bath of water or a bath of oil. And those colors then stay. And I've got a piece of a sample piece we're going to see in a later slide, which is the same color as when I made that piece in 1992. It's beautifully preserved.
Wow. And so I mean, that's an interesting thing then. Are you suggesting that the color will stay on that metal, whatever the metal is, like on the armor? And in theory, we should still be able to, a few hundred years later, see that same color, the same hue.
Yep, and they do survive, but where they don't obviously survive, then the trick is you have to go looking between plates and underneath rivet heads.
Right.
And being a private restorer, I was able to do things for clients that museums typically wouldn't go near because they think the buzzword now is reversible for conservation rather than restoration. But private restorers can do more. Now, that said, museums do carry out processes which are not reversible. Um, but because I can take off a rivet, let's say, take it out, then there's this little halo underneath it of the original color finish on the surface. So you can find an armor which is absolutely white now. And you take rivets out and you find traces of gold plating, you find traces of blue, black, purple. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Um,
So
Now,
they've taken the individual pieces to make up the armor, and they've tempered them
yeah,
according, and then put the rivets and things in, which is why I
yes,
suppose it's a bit like, spraying your car. You don't put the whole car together. You spray each of the panels and then fix them on to the
yeah,
final bit. Yeah.
yeah,
Just
absolutely. And these armors, they work on internal leathers, strips of leather, and rivets that slide in slots. Think of a Venetian blind, the way
mm,
the bits slide up and down. Some armors are like that. When you see long laminated sections down the legs, for example, or on the shoulders, those are moving on internal leathers. So these things, it's worth saying about armor, it wasn't cumbersome in the Great Period. You couldn't shoot it full of holes with arrows. You couldn't cut through it with swords. It was extremely expensive to make and highly effective because this is the point I'm going to come back to later is this is working clothing. These are for people who are that they need it to protect them because they're professional warriors. So if it's
yes.
now, although armor is always a compromise between defense, like say a tank, and
Right.
maneuverability, which is running around in a loincloth, somewhere you've got to have a compromise. And armor was developed to be highly effective, and so it cost an absolute fortune a lot of the time. So that they wouldn't have used it if it didn't work.
No, and we do tend to see, certainly in comedies, but in certain films, we do see the sort of very clunky armor where they you just realise it's got to be a joke because people could not function
Yeah.
or survive in that.
Well, in Olivier's Henry V, you see the French knights being winched into the saddle, but a knight in full armor without their helmet in the 15th century, we've got a beautiful little manuscript illustration of a guy turning a cartwheel on foot because his
Wow,
armor is so flexible, and they were expected to vault into the saddle without using the stirrups. And
gosh,
while we're at it, they didn't ride cart horses either. They rode destriers, which were highly bred animals with short backs, so they could take the weight, and they were strong and fast. So
brilliant.
you're
It's very,
you're talking about in analog terms, amazing technological development to create
yeah.
mobile. What it is these people are mobile fighting platforms.
And I imagine there are a few people who can produce that quality armor these days.
Yeah, there's a growing jousting circuit now where people are actually getting decent armor made. properly heat treated. And as the jousting gets more and more accurate, the list of injuries is growing steadily.
Oh dear.
Yes. Well, the point is the stuff worked, but nothing like this is infallible. So
Yes.
there are some horrendous period descriptions of people being killed in what are effectively sports events, not on the battlefield, but just having feats of arms, jousting with friends, à plaisance. That is, not a outrance, not a joust of war, but a joust of peace. And unfortunately, we will see an example of this later. People lost eyes. There's an account of a Spanish feat of arms where the lance managed to pierce the brow of the guy's helmet, and he was walking around with a foot of lance sticking out the front of his helmet,
God.
and he was saying, "I'm fine, I'm fine." It's just like the Black Knight in Monty Python.
Oh yes.
It's just a flesh wound.
It's just a flesh wound. Oh dear. And of course, I guess if you're wounded and you're in the armour, I mean, unlike now when you go to A&E and they just get a pair of scissors and cut through your clothes in order to get to the wound, it must have been quite a difficult process then to get that armour off for anybody who can be saved by surgeons or whomever,
Yeah.
to get the armour off without, taking more of the wound with you.
Well, one at that same event in Spain, one chap was hit underneath the arm, underneath the pretty much around the bicep, because the armor didn't cover him. Armpits are difficult things because of the flexibility of the arm,
Yes.
and the lance went straight through it, and the surgeons took him away to manage to get the armor off him. And it said that when they removed the lance, that the blood flowed from the wound like fresh wine from the spigot.
Oh.
At which point he fainted, unsurprisingly.
Yes. Good God.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
So,
Right.
so we've got all these. We have accounts of combat like this. We have accounts of battles and what happened in those, and we have surviving armor. So now, what people tend to do now is we jump onto the next slide.
Yep. Let me just go back and find it. Here it is.
Right. So people tend to look at period art as if they're looking at photography,
Right.
and they'll look. These are various works of art from the Great Period. They're all 15th century, apart from the chap Dobson, who's 14th century. And what they'll do is they'll say, "Oh, well, if that's a picture of a guy in a mirror polished armor, say the chap on the horse, top left. Now that's grey." They'll say, so the painting must have discolored. It must have darkened because it should be bright white." Right. Well, that particular artist, Lusquegia, he silver leafed the surfaces of the armor, and then he applied a tinted lacquer over the top. So the effect he intended was to have this sort of sparkling, dark, sparkling surface, but not bright white. And actually, that's a panel painting from about 1440, and it's in very, very good condition. So that is exactly what the artist intended. So we look at the chap top center, and his armor is pale blue. And what people tend to say about that is, well, you see, that's how the artist intended to portray polished metal. Or, or they'll say, well, that's the color of the sky reflected in it.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another convenient excuse. While we're looking at him, please note his sword blade is the same color as his helmet and the mail. Okay, just
Yes.
file that away for later. Now, you can start to pick holes in these arguments. If you look at the big picture on the right, is a panel painting by a Florentine artist around about 1475. And notice that half the warriors are wearing armor that appears to be black.
Yes.
While the other half are wearing armor that appears to be, well, it is grey. Now, this is only a detail of this painting, and if you were to look at the whole of it, 3/4 of the guys in that painting have got the dark armor. So for a start, we're seeing in proportion terms, most of them have armor which is coloured in some way. So you can't trot out the argument that, well, this painting's discoloured. Well, if that's the case, why have half the people in this picture got discoloured armor and the other half don't have? That doesn't stand up. So then they'll say, well, that grey colour you see, again, that's how the artist intended to show white armor. Also know Bottom left, we have two fellows who've been struck to the ground. This is a painting of the resurrection of Christ, and they are from the same picture. It's from 1491, so we're still in the Great Period. Now, if you look at the guy on the left with the beard, notice his armour is that pale grey colour.
Mm.
But the guy on the right, look at the armour protecting his knees and his belly, is white. So this again, this discounts the idea that this grey armour is necessarily just how the artist intended to show white armour. And even though it appears to have quite a high polish, there's no problem with an oxide colour finish. You can put colour finishes on armour over the top of a bright polish. So you will get, what happens is the light comes in, passes through the oxide layer, bounces off the surface of the steel, comes out again and refracts through, and you get this interference pattern, which then creates the colour to the human eye. Okay, so.
And I was just going to say that presumably the material the painter is painting on, and of course the pigments that were available at that time, I would imagine people would go, oh yeah, if you were painting in acrylic or in anything modern,
Brilliant.
you'd have a different thing. But and again, that's something that you go into in detail and remind us that of course you couldn't just nip down to the shops and go and buy a palette of Dulex emulsion or whatever it was to do your painting with. They had to find different ways, and the surface of the wood or the canvas or the leather or whatever it's being painted on would change, presumably, how it is. And then there's time.
Yep. And some pigments do change colour. They're called fugitive pigments. That's why in some paintings, if you go somewhere like the National Gallery and you look at some medieval paintings, the faces are green. Now that's not because they were having an off day or they're space aliens or something.
Yes, green with envy.
Yes, it's actually because the colours used there are fugitive, and the green is a thing called terra verde, which is the underpainting. So as the colours painted over the top, because they built these paintings up in layers, and what's happened is the layer over the top, flesh tones, have gone. They're just broken down completely, and you're left with the underpainting. So that's why some of these pictures will change colour. And also the blues, for example, which were used to paint armour, some of them are a lot more expensive than others, and they lasted longer. So again, you're down to the skill of the painter and the materials he or his patron can afford to use. And then, of course, you're hoping that painting doesn't get restored, as you said, just like suits of armour, paintings get restored. And that's why, again, go into the National Gallery, which is my favourite museum in London, and the paintings look fantastic. And that's because they've all been worked on. In one way or another, they've been conserved. Some of them have been restored. And there's one painting by an artist called Pisanello, who, again, North Italian, and it shows St. George. And St. George in a white armour. And this is often held up as an example of, look, there's the saint in white armour. Except that while it was still in a private Italian collection a good 100 years ago, it got the works done to it. It got completely restored to the extent it was repainted in large part. And guess what? It was the armour of St. George that got repainted.
Yeah.
So because in Pisanello's other works, the armour is grey or dark grey.
So this makes your work, you turn into an art and armour detective, trying to get, to look at the different things that have happened to either the art or the metal, and sort of discount so much to get back to the original, so that you can categorically say, this is how it would have looked, and actually the journey it's had is so different now as we look at it.
Oh yeah, well, at the end of this, I'll mention a book I've got coming out next year called San Romano, The Art of War. And these are 3 great battle paintings by an artist called Paolo Uccello. And again, these are classic sources for people who want to look at armour in paintings. 3 huge paintings. One's in the National Gallery in London, one's in the Louvre in Paris, and one's in the Uffizi in Florence. And they're meant to be a group of 3. Okay? Now, they're all by the same artist. There's no doubt about that. But in the book, I go through, and apologies for the aircraft going coming
Don't
over at the
worry.
moment, if you can hear it.
It's probably spraying the skies.
Yes, probably, yes. They found out we're recording.
Yes.
They've come for us. So in that book, I do exactly that. I take apart the three paintings. I show how they were painted, who they were painted for. That the museums that have got them don't even have them under the right names, because a document in a Florentine archive gives us the original names for these
My goodness.
paintings. And you can go into the National Gallery today and it will still say next to it, The Battle of San Romano by Paolo Uccello, except it's not. So, so the other thing we have is you've got a narrative built up over these things, and they stick to it. So it's always been known as the Battle of San Romano, and it forevermore will be the Battle of San Romano. Trying to shift um, the narrative on these things is extraordinarily difficult.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
um,
So
bit,
entrenched.
bit like the Shakespeare question, but
Yeah. Yes.
move on from that.
Move on
Okay,
to that.
so let's then, now we've looked at different colors in paintings. Now we get descriptions. If you want to jump onto the next slide,
Yeah.
we get descriptions of colors. There's a guy writing in the 1620s who gives us a list of colors. One is russet. We come into that right now. And he also describes sanguine, black, and white or milled. That's in the 17th century. So already he's given us a menu, if you like, of different colors. And when we go through other documents, like the 1547 inventory of Henry VIII, you get armors which are described as black from the fire, so hammer finished, and annealed blue. Annealing is another term for tempering. So that again is proof that the people making the armor had first hardened it and then they tempered it to give it a blue color. Now, but in all of these documents, we get so many pieces which are never described. We get descriptions of white, gilded, blue, peacock blue, black, silvered, you name it. But we get thousands of pieces where no actual description is mentioned. And what must have been happening is that the people who drew up these lists, it was taken for granted. It's like Ford Model Ts. It's like just an inventory of Ford Model Ts and describing them all as black. You know, it's a given they were black,
Yes.
apart from presumably some special examples. But then if you had an inventory of Ford Model Ts and one was white, you get Model T, Model T, Model T, white Model T, Model T, Model T, like that.
Yes.
So we can infer that the notaries who drew up these lists were assuming that people who read them would know what this nondescript color was. So if we go back to the slide, this is it. Now, we have another Florentine painting, top left, the life of Nicholas of Bari, and look at that warrior. He's got a lovely grey armour on. Okay. Mm-hmm. Beneath him, St. George by Herlin, grey armour and grey sword. Now, we move across to the right. What we've got, that funny sort of shield-shaped thing, is a chafron. It's a head defence for a horse. And that's in Philadelphia now. And if you look to the right of it, where I put those little black arrows on the photo, those are the traces of the original grey, where they couldn't be cleaned off by some over-enthusiastic restorer or somebody working for a dealer in arms and armour. So often the damage that occurs to these things happens when they come onto the open market, because then dealers wanted to have complete armours to sell to their clients, and they wanted them to be nice and shiny. So that, you know, they devastated a lot of stuff. And that happens from, really, it starts beginning of the 19th century. So this has been going on a couple of hundred years. Now, look down, the star-shaped thing, that's German, like the armour shown in the Herlin painting of St. George. And that's a thing called a Bessegue, lovely medieval word. And it protects the armpit. It would be attached to the shoulder defence. There'd be typically one on either side. Sometimes there was only one on the left side. And look at that grey colour. Now, that is what I found when I cleaned. It was a thick layer of black paint, lead paint on it. And that's not after I've cleaned up rust with an abrasive. It hasn't changed from brown to grey. That is what I found. And there are heavy grind marks on it. People watching on a smart TV will be able to see there's clear, crystal clear grind marks. And we've even got a description for that from Italian documents from 600 years ago. It's called traversato, traversed. So it's been, we'd now say, cross-ground. So you can see how they've ground off the hammer finish surface, and then it's been slack quenched. It's been put in the forge. It's been taken up to a dull red. They've taken it out, said a quick Hail Mary, and then into the bath of oil after it's gone back to grey. Now, the spearhead on the right is Austrian, early 15th century, and again, look at the grey colour. People tend to say, it's just discoloured in time. No, it hasn't. It's well preserved, because this is the grey we find everywhere. And the last thing, the helmet at the bottom, is North Italian. And just as an aside, the major production centres for armour in the 15th century, Milan was top dog, dominated the international arms trade, and another North Italian city called Brescia. And then later on in Germany, we have Augsburg and Nuremberg and Landshut are the big centres. And between them, these centres were producing vast amounts. There was a military industrial complex even in the 14th century, going back further. But anyway, that's a good example of a hammer finished armour. That's what they mean by black from the hammer.
Black from the hammer.
Yeah.
So those photos, I mean, they look like they're just black and white photos, but they're colour photos. That's just the genuine reproduction of those items.
Yeah, you can see that helmet has got brass cap rivets around it. Yeah.
No.
And the spear on the right has got brass wings, and it's got a little bit of gilding on the blade.
Yeah.
But now, so this is looking for russet grey. And incidentally, I'll explain why russet grey, because russet comes from the medieval French word rousser, means to redden. And to create this colour, you have to redden the piece in the forge first, then let it go cold, and into the bath it goes. Okay, and that fixes the colour. So that's why you might call it russet. There's also, mind you, russet was a type of cloth produced in the Middle Ages in England, and russet cloth could be grey, because the Ballad of Piers Plowman describes somebody glad of a gown of grey russet.
Interesting. Yeah. So you can't necessarily go by what we would contemporarily think of as russet being a sort of reddish colour, but it is by the tempering, process. And
people have also interpreted this as a form of controlled rusting. They didn't rust armour. It might have gone that way in the field when these poor so-and-sos were out in all weathers for months at a time fighting. Yes. Yeah, maybe. But then it would be brought back in, and a huge amount of the work that armourers did. And another thing here, armour was made by armourers and swords were made by swordsmiths. They were not made by blacksmiths. It was a specific craft.
Yes.
So much business went to the armourers and swordsmiths because pieces would be brought back in after months in the field and have to be refurbished. Just like taking your car for a service. It's the same thing. So we've gone from finding traces of colour to show that there was a darker surface finish, okay? But there are other ways of proving that there must have been a surface finish, even if it's gone. So if we go to the next slide, we can have a look at a sword.
Let's have a look at the sword. Here we go.
Right. Now, on the left, we have a painting of the Archangel Michael by Simone Martini, 1325, there or thereabouts. Now, look at the sword he's holding. It's dark. And so you would tend to have people wheel out the odd excuse of, see, it's discoloured, painting's discoloured. Except look at the cutting edge of the sword on the side furthest from the angel's face. It's white.
Yes.
And there's also a white rib running down the centre of the blade. Okay, so now we look at the sword in the middle, and this is a genuine North Italian sword from circa 1270 to 1330. So that's bang on the period of production of that painting. And you can see now it's brightly polished. Now, the grip on that is the grip I made for it when I restored it. But when I was restoring it, I made an interesting discovery. If we look bottom right, that's a close-up of the blade. And what you can't see in the channel in the center called a fuller are the letters IND for in nomine Domini, in the name of the Lord. And they're inlaid in solid silver on both sides of the blade. Now, they're almost invisible now. My black lettering is above them in the precise position. And it's only because there's a bit of corrosion on the blade that you can see them. But if you mirror polish that blade, they'd be completely invisible. So what would the point be of inlaying silver into a polished steel blade? If we look at the picture above, that's the same sword looking down at the recess at the front of the crossguard. And what do we find? We find that grey oxide finish. Now, for people who say, oh, yeah, but that grey oxide's been left there after manufacture, and they assembled it, and then they cleaned up the crossguard and the blade, and that just got left in that recess where they couldn't clean it. No, because the grind marks you can see running down the blade there go underneath the oxide layer. And also, if that had been assembled and then cleaned up, I would expect horizontal grind marks going across. So
yes, of course.
Right. So put these two things together, and it shows us that that blade, and I would say the crossguard and the pommel, all had a russet grey oxide finish.
So the reason you would see in the picture the white bit is because you do sharpen a blade. So that would be the only area that is really going to change colour, because you're... Yeah.
And if you imagine you're a warrior out in the field and not just thinking of the weather, about piddling down with rain, or, you know, when they had weather in those days.
Yeah, back in the day.
500
years ago, thanks.
Yes. You never see any of those strange crisscross lines in the sky in paintings in the 15th century. I don't know
not yet. Not yet. But you never know. There'll be an army of people putting them in.
They'll be working on that, yeah. Well, you've got to remember, these are essentially butcher's weapons. You're going to cut people up with these things, and blood causes corrosion as well. So if you're going to fight with these things, so it's not just the armor which is given a color finish to protect it; it's the blades as well.
Right. So, yes, of course.
So you now there's no doubt from some paintings we can see white sword blades in contrast to the armor worn by the people carrying them. So once again, there were some people who had white sword blades. I'm not doubting that at all. I'm simply saying we have to look at the proportions. And far and away, what we see time and again is this grey colour finish. And I think this is what you might say, standard finish that is never mentioned in these documents describing the contents of arsenals. Now, carrying on the inlaid silver theme, we can go back in time, even where there are no paintings we can use for reference, and we can infer more from those. So off we go again.
Yeah, let me get to the next slide. Here it is. Oh, there it is.
There we go.
Now, look at that lot.
Right. Now this is where fans of Roman military equipment and reenactors are doubtless going to start throwing things at their smart TVs. But
I hope not.
Bear with me, people. Bear with me. On the left, we have a Viking sword from the 10th century, and the pommel and the crossguard are inlaid with silver. Now, it's also the black patterning on there is actually a form of silver oxide called niella. So that's not a case of on a darkened iron or steel ground. But I include it here to show that this was still what they wanted. They wanted a contrast finish. And if we look at the helmet in the center, and I regret to say you will not find this in any museum, this is in a private collection, that is probably North Italian, and it's from the early 10th century. And what do we find once again? Silver inlay on the nasal and around.
Isn't that? It's so beautifully done, though.
And it's actually a face. It just beneath that rivet on the brow.
Oh yes, yes.
It's a pair of eyes. Now, so this changes our idea about Norman knights, because this is just before the Norman invasion of England.
Right.
So again, now we used to think of this as Dark Ages. People now call it early medieval. But again, these people are on their horses out fighting for months at a time. So they would want something which would be preserved from the elements. But anyway, here we are. We've got this lovely, beautifully produced silver inlay. And then bottom left, now that's 7th century. So it's a buckle, not a piece of armor, but it's the same thing all over again. And this is in our local museum here. This comes from a Lombard cemetery just down the road. 7th century, beautiful example of silver inlay with knotwork on an iron buckle. Right.
I mean,
So
that's exquisite. The detail
yeah,
that's in there from the 7th century.
yeah, and there's that particular cemetery yielded quite a few of these. Um, Now, let's go back further in time. Top right, and we have three dagger scabbards, which are Roman from the 2nd century AD. What do we find?
Wow,
Silver inlay. Same,
silver inlay.
same thing again. And they would also have, you can see little sort of circular, the one in the center, you can see little circular nodules down the sides. Those are cups, non-ferrous metal cups, which were filled with probably red enamel or colored enamel, certainly. So this is a thing the Romans sort of adopted from the Celts, where you have enamel inlay brightening up things. So you've got to think of a dark grey surface, maybe even a blackened surface, with brilliant silver inlay as a contrast, and then these little flashes of colour from enamel. Right, now that is a dagger scabbard. Okay, these are not pieces of armour, but now we're into an area where we've got no colour paintings preserved of Roman soldiers from this period. And you know, there are one or two from Italy, but they tend to show bronze armor rather than iron armor. But what we do have is finds of Roman legionary helmets, like the one at the bottom there with the broad neck guard. Now that skull is a reconstruction in plastic because the actual skull just corroded away. But what we can see is they really liven them up with, this is bronze or brass applied in strips that'll guard over the ear, around the edge of the neck guard, around the cheek pieces, and you've got that sort of little temple motif on the cheek piece, and a dolphin either side of the brow. So it's just interesting that what we have again is something which would be a contrast. And when the Romans wanted to make something white, we've got examples of that strip body armor, which we now call lorica segmentata, which are tin plated. So again, I think, I'm extrapolating here, but I think what we've got is a clear example of these soldiers were out in all weathers. They were expected to march 20 miles a day in all weathers. When they got to where they were going, if there wasn't a fort there, if they were in hostile territory, they had to build a field fortification in their armor, right, wearing their armor. So you're telling me that these Roman legionaries had these beautifully polished body armors, and they would then start effectively digging the garden in. What do you think is going to happen to your lovely shiny armor if you're up to your knees in mud digging a trench? And also, they had to ford rivers where there were no bridges, and sometimes they even built bridges. And Trajan's column has a lovely example of Roman legionaries up to their waists in a river, building a bridge, wearing their armor. So you simply cannot tell me that these guys had polished armor. And also, I started off in a Roman reenactment group a very long time ago, and I remember that the sinking feeling, although I tended to wear mail, not the base armor, but the sinking feeling, even when there was a light rain shower, you think, oh God, there goes the evening in the pub.
That's it. Out with a brasso.
Exactly, which is what they didn't do.
They wouldn't have time, would they? They wouldn't have had time to fiddle about with their, you know.
And then the very next day, they've got to ford another river, and they've got to do it again.
Yeah.
I would be incredibly surprised if their armor wasn't all hammer finished. Really.
Do you think they would have placed some sort of animal fats, you know, if they're in water and things like that, some animal fats to protect the metal, and also if it's interwoven or interlinked, just to keep, you know, like grease in a way, to keep it rather than, you know, metal on metal, which would gouge.
Well, I'd certainly think animal fats would be used, and we know that they oiled armor, and we're going to see an example of that very shortly. Because it's prevention is better than cure, so you've got to stop the corrosion starting before it happens. So yes, they would absolutely.
And of course, it would make it move much more nicely. You know, if you've got, you know, that sort of armadillo effect, because if it's going to rust, that's the last thing you want. Crunching. It's just here comes Brian. We can hear him a mile off.
Yes,
it's the last thing you want.
Well, now I am going to mention that later, we've got a perfect example of a 14th century account of squires taking care of armor for that very reason. Just before we leave this, though, if we just pop back to that slide, this last helmet, bottom right. Now, this is one of the few Roman helmets, this comes from Holland, to survive in a condition where we've got the original surface. It's a cavalry helmet. It's missing a big pair of cheek pieces. You can see the arch there for the ear. It would have covered the ear completely, and there would have been another arch over the top there with a sort of decorative ear guard. And on the brow, you can see that flat area, and there would have been a non-ferrous metal, bronze or brass plate there, probably decorated with a Medusa head or something. Now, all well and good. You can see on the brow particularly, it's hammer finished. But, fair enough, it was covered up. So you can argue that the armourer who made it wasn't going to waste his time polishing up something that was going to be covered anyway. But we look at the rest of the helmet, and you can see those sort of strips running in channels, and then those what look like, well, it's meant to represent human hair. It's a hairstyle. And right now, that's hammer finished. Thankfully, it survives to the point where we can say absolutely it was never polished. The whole thing was hammer finished and left that way. Now, there are examples of these helmets which have got laurel wreaths embossed on them, and those laurel wreaths are gilded or silvered. Now, if you blackened that hammer surface, it's dead easy, just quench it in oil, it'll go black. And you flame off the oil afterwards, and it will go jet black. Now, if you then applied gilding or silvering like a laurel wreath around the brow, it would look like a human head, black Mediterranean hair, with a gilded laurel wreath worn around it. So it's intentional.
Yeah. Gosh.
So that is one example, a very, very rare example where we could say definitely that helmet was blackened. It wasn't polished.
Good gracious.
So if you can, fans of Roman armor can now pick themselves up off the carpet.
and just on that, do you get a lot of pushback on what you're saying? Yeah.
Did I ever?
Yeah.
When
are people coming round to it now? They're sort of beginning to go, well, actually, that Chris Dobson, he's got a point there.
Well, there were some strange reactions when it came out. I'm not on social media for sound mental health reasons. I avoid it. But somebody was sending me what you might call my press cuttings. How kind. And I simply could not repeat on this show, as it's pretty much a family show. I could not repeat the language that was used. You can boil it all down to who the dotting hell does this person think he is? Well, he's someone who's spent 4 decades working on the real thing.
Yeah. And I guess there's a lot of vested interest in those people who have polished up quite a lot and maybe destroyed the integral part of what they may have invested in.
Some of the pictures in the book are from the 1990s. They're pictures I took myself of armors. And I then compare the armors today, and the colors I show have gone. So even in the last 30 years, and it's going on now. So these pieces in museums are still I don't blame the conservators. They've been taught that these things were polished bright. If you find a scuzzy surface on it, clean it off, because it must be an old coat of lacquer, or it's discolored, or it's a corrosion product. Get rid of it. So I don't blame them for an instant.
No.
But you've got this whole industry around this now, where people are making polished armor and selling it. People are taking part in events for the public, reenactment shows in their lovely polished armor. And it's
just perpetuating that myth.
Yeah, and Hollywood's doing it as well.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of this started, ironically, it was in the 19th century when collectors wanted nice bright shiny armor, and romantic novels were depicting knights in shining armor. And also, as we come into the 20th century, then warfare takes a truly horrendous turn and becomes mechanized. And I think at this point, antiquarians desperately needed some honorable chivalric past to cling on to, which wasn't like the hell they were seeing unleashed across Europe.
Yeah.
in the 20th century. But the truth was that the warriors who were fighting on horseback or on the ground, on foot, or even in trenches, were going through the same conditions that soldiers had in World War I and World War II. It's no different. So to expect them to prance around the field of battle in these lovely shiny armors is a nonsense.
No,
But
absolutely.
but now, as you say, these are it's a hobby for a lot of people. They love getting their kit ready for the next season, polishing it all up. Got to be ready. And oh dear, it's just sorry, guys. The good side is now, yes. To come back to your point, there was pushback. There was some. I wound up thinking of it as pure venom. Really nasty stuff. Um, but equally, the book was bought by a lot of museums, so that's now being digested by their conservators. And I think as a result of that, we're going to find museums publishing a lot more about color finishes they've found on armors and weapons. And also, I know I've made a bit of work for modern armorers because I know a lot of them bought the book as well. But even so, this weird thing has happened. Even though modern craftsmen have bought the book and they're clearly learning from it and using it, because as an armorer myself, the point was not only do I show how to interpret paintings, I show the color finishes surviving on the real thing. I then, as you know, having read it, I then show how to reproduce the colors. So I'm demonstrating that, look, see this color in this painting and on this suit of armor, this is what it looked like here. So the very fact I can then demonstrate how it was done has allowed people to do it themselves. But one guy, here's an example. Even now, some people who are doing it don't want to doff the old cap to me and say, Chris, you got it right. There's one guy who makes, we'll just say, things. I'll spare his blushes by not saying what things. And he wrote to me recently, about a year after he bought the book, and said, yeah, you might have a point. I've been looking at it. I finally got round to reading it. Couldn't wait to get his hands on it when he bought it. Finally got round to reading it after a year. I think, you probably got a point in some cases. And shortly after, somebody sent me a photograph of a piece this person had made. And they said, is this particular colour you mentioned in the book? And it's made by this guy. And I said, yep, and it's a beautiful example. It looks absolutely great. So on the one hand, this guy is saying to me personally, well, maybe you got a point. But then actually, he's already making the stuff and
he's
selling
making it. Yeah. Authentically coloured.
Yes. Thanks, mate. Thanks for telling me. Yeah.
We better move on to the next slide as time is creeping past.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So, not only do we have pale blues, we have dark blues. Florentine painting on the left, and then an Italian inkwell of a knight next to it. Note how they're wearing dark blue armor. These have not discolored. Look at the painting, the picture with the black background in the center, the back of a helmet skull. Now, that's a helmet I restored a few years ago, and it was the skull is about 1550 German, and it was upgraded in Italy around about 1600 to 1610 for a tournament. And part of the upgrade was they put reinforcing plates on the back of the skull. So you can see in the photo there what I found when I took them off and took off the crest holder, which was just in the center there. Lovely inky dark blue. Okay, so again, people will say, yeah, but that's 17th century. Okay, point taken. Now let's look at the sort of what looks like a brown lump in the bottom photo. Is actually a helmet, an excavated piece, which has that's a male aventail still attached to it. It's the only helmet ever to have been found with its original male aventail still attached. And you can see a vaguely bluey cast to the front of the skull of the helmet. But if you look at the detail next to it with the white arrows, what do we have? Midnight blue, dark blue. Because when I cleaned it up, that piece came out from underneath. That's a piece of the back of the skull. And it came out from underneath a lump of concretion that was over it. And that's the best preserved section of the color on the helmet. What's behind it is some of the liner. These things also had padded linen liners. You wouldn't want to stick a helmet on get a whack over the head with a mace and have the kinetic energy transferred directly to your skull. So these things, like modern crash helmets, they were heavily padded. So anyway, there we have a dark blue, and that helmet is about 1325 to 1350. So Middle Ages. And no doubt it's dark blue, and we see that in 14th century paintings as well. But the sword on the right, which is an absolute stunner, is the imperial coronation sword of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, made in Palermo in Sicily before 1220. So we're back in the 13th century now, and look at the colour of the blade. And as you said earlier, look at the cutting edges where it would be sharpened. They're white.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, the pommel was changed in the 14th century in Prague, but this is in the Imperial Treasury Vienna. It's fabulous. But that makes, at the very latest, that makes that colouring of the blade 14th century. Right. So this again is bearing out, and I think it's original 13th century, but this bears out exactly what we see in paintings. So we've now had grey, black, and now we've got dark blue, and we can add some more colours to that. Pale blue, described as azzurro in Italian documents, and annealed blue in the Henry VIII inventory. Top left, 14th century group of men-at-arms in a crucifixion painting. Note again, the blade of the sword is the same colour. Then we have Louis XII of France in a manuscript of 1498 to 99. Look at his legs. Look at that beautiful pale blue, and the forearms of his armour, pale blue. Okay, yes. So are these two examples of artists showing bright armour reflecting the colour of the sky? Nope, because look at the gauntlet in the centre, top centre. When I took that apart, it's got a long cuff plate. Underneath that cuff plate, you see the detailed picture below. What did I find? Pale blue.
Pale blue.
Beautifully, and there's your rust from your man making the scratchy sound when he walks. Now, okay, so this is end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century. All right, so we need to find something from back in the 15th century. And look at the armour down there. That's the armour of Friedrich the Victorious in Vienna, made around about 1451, gauntlets later. It's composite, helmets made by a guy called Il Bisaglia, and the rest of the armour is probably made by members of the Del Corno family. You'll have to read my books if you want to know why I think it's the Del Corno family. But top right, we have a detail of the inner breastplate, the shoulder. And where my black arrows mark in there is a lovely strip of pale blue oxide. It's been cleaned off the rest of the armour completely.
Yeah.
Now, that armour, when it was new, was entirely pale blue, and the fixtures on it were gilded, and we know from some surviving traces that all the straps were covered in crimson silk velvet. So imagine what that was like when it was new. Absolutely stunning.
Yes, stunning. Absolutely stunning.
Okay, so we can get even better now.
Yes.
Now, there's a colour.
When I saw these pictures in the book, they just blew me away.
Right. Now, when we have a colour which is described as sanguine, bloody at the beginning, and also as peacock blue, and also in Italian documents described as bronzed, because you can produce a slightly browner version of this colour. But the armour on the left is by a fellow called Anton Pfeffenhauser, made in 1591, part of a group of 12, and you can see that is a purplish colour, and it's got gilded it's got acid etching and then gilding on top of it.
Look at that. It's just absolutely amazing, isn't it?
Now that's suffered slightly. It's a little bit worn, but it gives us a good impression of the colour. Now, in documents of the time, in the centre we've got the Inventario Illuminado, produced in the 16th century in Spain, and this is an armour made by somebody called Caramola Modrone of Mantua in Italy. And look at the colour. It's this pinky, purpley colour. And this is what they described as peacock blue, or bleu de pavon in Spain. And if you look beneath, there are some real peacock's feathers. And so by peacock blue, they don't mean the brilliant blue of the peacock's throat. No. They mean this colour on the tail feathers. Now, at the beginning, we saw a purple tempering colour.
Yeah.
And the two pieces on the right are the same piece made by me as test, and I said I made this in 1992, and it still looks like this today. Now, The piece above is the temper colors as you see them. Okay.
Right.
Now, then we do a magic trick. We talked about oiling armor to preserve it from the elements. And if you oil armor like this, I took the first photo and then I put cloth, oil on cloth, gave it a wipe over, and then I took the second photo minutes later, and it's changed the interference pattern. And what color has it gone? Pinky purple. Exactly the same color you see in the manuscript illustration, exactly the same color as the peacock's tail feathers. So
yeah.
now that plate on the right is part of the shoulder piece of the Chevalier Bayard, early 16th century French, and those roped strips would have been gilded on the original. So again, you've got to think of that color at the top there, this brilliant livid blue purple with added gilded decoration. But then we have now we're going to come on to this next slide, and again, people are going to be tearing their hair out, but here we go. Now, this is the Helmschmidt family of Augsburg. Now, on the left, we have Kollmann Helmschmidt, the armor of the Emperor Ferdinand, 1526.
Wow.
Now, it's stunning, and then they had horse armors as well. And this is a beautiful example of one. Now, it's nice and shiny and white now, except that the conservation department have found traces of peacock blue all over it. and I've seen them. So again, and those things like that monster's face on, it's called a petrel, the chest plate for the horse, that would have been gilded. There's a monster on the chafron on the horse's head, that would have been gilded. So once again, brilliant pinky purple armor with gilded decoration. Now the picture in the center is one hell of an armor. Same man, Kollmann Helmschmidt, etching done by a fellow called Hans Bugmeier, and it's deliberately made to look like clothing, like a Landsknecht. So that's a perfect example, folks, of when you go into a museum and you look at a thing in a case and it says this helmet is German and it's 1400, and there's not a mention of the fact that it might be two completely different helmets, cut and shut, if you like, stitched together.
Yes.
For the market in the early 20th century, for the collector who bought it, and that collector then bequeathed it to the museum later on.
Yeah. A bit like having a classic car and no one's told you they've changed the bonnet.
Yeah, exactly.
From a Morris Traveller to, I don't know, Ford Cortina, and they've made it fit.
And then they've painted it Ferrari red.
Yes, that's it. And it's like, it's all one thing. It's genuine. Yeah. That's how it was found.
Exactly.
Oh, dear. So I think you said to me this book is no longer in print at the moment.
As a stroke of marketing genius, I've come on the show to talk about a book you can't buy because it was a limited print run and they've all gone. But
it is a beautiful book. I mean, I just must show you, you've got all those pictures and more. I mean, and it's so beautifully put together.
Thank you. Okay. Well, the good news is that although they're not all about coloured armour, the current book I've got out, there it is. Whoops, hang on.
Oh, look at that.
There, hang on. There we go.
There we are.
Art and Armour in the Western Alps. That's about 15th century armour in Italy, and it's got a section all about armour colours in it. For people who are fans of arms and armour, lots in there. And also, coming out, it'll be after Christmas now, my next book is about Italian armour in the German style, alla tedesca. That's also got a whole section about our armour colours in it at the back, but also for the first time in a book, whenever I show a photograph of an original piece in a museum or a private collection, if it can be ascertained, I give you the original surface colour finish. So, wow. If you like, it builds on the book you've got. So even if people have got that first book, these other two books are going to be useful. And if you haven't got that book and you haven't got much hope of getting it, well, go to somewhere like the Royal Armouries and you'll find copies in their library. Major museums will have copies in their libraries. You can find them there. But you can get these other two books and you'll find lots.
And are they available from your website?
Yes, they are. I know you put the link in the description.
I will put it in there, but if you just tell people what it is, because some people with smart TVs can't get the description for some reason. Especially if
they've thrown things at the screens now and broken them. Yeah.
Well, that's it.
Okay, so the website is renaissancedissident.com. all one word,
Renaissance.
renaissancedistant.com, and there's a link on the homepage to my publications. And
Fantastic.
the next, and for those people more interested in art and history, on the 1st of March, I've got a new edition of my book, San Romano, The Art of War, all about those paintings by Uccello. So if you're interested in decoding paintings, unpeeling the layers of symbolism, all the stuff in there, that book's for you. You'll find lots to interest you. And if you like arms and armor, there's loads of pictures of warriors in there as well.
Ah, fantastic. Chris, it's so fascinating. This is not an area that I've looked at before. You know, I've gone round various things and gone, oh, yeah, it's nice to see some armour there. And you sort of give it a cursory glance. You have now sort of excited the next time I'm in there, be looking and scrutinizing, because it gives you, I think it's like anything. When you go to a museum, you can be overwhelmed with all these old pieces and things and go, oh, yeah, that's nice and that's nice. But if you've got something that you can then go, hang on a second, let me just look at that. It takes you into another world, and that's what you've done.
Good, glad to have done it.
Ah, excellent. Well, we've gone over my normal hour by a little bit, but I think it was worth it. Thank you so much, Chris, for coming on the show. Thank you for the book. I not quite finished it yet, but I'm ploughing through, which will something to do over Christmas, of course. I will, of course, be back with more monologues and more wonderful guests, but a big thank you, Chris, for all the pictures and everything else. And from myself and Chris, I think we're getting a bit of delay now anyway, but until next time,
Okay.
thanks for watching and goodbye.